So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. James Paul, who I've had the pleasure of knowing for, I think, almost 30 years, right back when Jim was a medical student and I was working for the Christian Medical Fellowship in the UK. And Jim studied medicine at the Royal Free Medical School in London, England, and he went on to specialize in palliative medicine, so working with dying patients. And he worked briefly for the Christian Medical Fellowship in the UK for a couple of years in the 1990s as a student staff worker, but then later did theological training at Cornhill, London, and then a master's in bioethics. And he's been on the leadership team at L'Abri in Gretham in Hampshire, England, since 2004, I think it is. And he took over the director role from Andrew Fellows there just 5 years ago. Jim has a new book coming out very shortly. You can pre-order it on Amazon, and its title is What on Earth is Heaven? So let me encourage you to look at that, and we'll send you a link to it afterwards. Jim is married to Merrin, who is a clinical psychologist from South Africa, and they have 2 children, Jack and Sam. So Jim, we're delighted to have you on ICMDA webinars, and we look forward to being enlightened about is reality socially constructed? Over to you.
Hi, Peter. Hello, everybody. Lovely to, well, I was going to say lovely to see you all, but I can't see you all. But it's lovely to be able to speak to you and share some of these ideas that I've been working on for the last few years. Let's think about why this is an important topic and why an important topic for doctors and people in medicine. Workers in healthcare. The reason I think this is important is because it is a background topic for a lot of what is happening in the field of medicine. And as we go through the talk, I think you'll see how relevant this is to a lot of issues around sexuality, for example, around transgender, around identity, and particularly the way that we think about ethics, or the way that, not we think, but I would say the way that the cultures that we live in think about ethics. And so this is really, it's like a background to understanding what's going on, I would say, particularly in Western culture, but obviously it's influences the whole world. And this is I guess it's a lecture in a way about sociology, but one of my colleagues made an interesting comment how in, say, the last decade, sociology has become incredibly powerful as an explanatory tool for our societies. And it's really taken over the role, certainly of religion, and also philosophy, in explaining how things are the way that they are. And so I think this is going to be hopefully very helpful as a kind of background to help you understand, if you're thinking what's going on in our culture, why are people thinking the way they do, why are they making the decisions that they do? This is a sort of background that will help you understand that. Okay, so let me move on with the lecture. This is just to show you a little bit about L'Abri. This is where I work. It's French for the shelter, because the first one was in Switzerland, in French-speaking Switzerland. And it's based around the ideas and practice of Francis and Edith Schaeffer. And you may have come across Francis Schaeffer. He was, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, one of the first people to do cultural apologetics. And it's actually a community where we welcome people to come and live with us and ask their questions about the Christian faith. And so this lecture's really come from the sort of questions that students are asking. People that come and stay at L'Abri are wondering about, these kind of questions that I'm going to deal with today. So it really hopefully comes from real questions that people are asking. And yeah, if you want to find out more about L'Abri, I'm sure Peter or Josh can put you in touch with me and put you in touch with us. Okay, so let's...
更多的资料，所以让我们来看。
Okay, so Sorry, I can hear someone translating, I think. Let's see. Okay, so we're going to get into the lecture now. And what is the issue that I want to talk about today? Well, let me give you some examples of questions. So how do we know that boys wear blue and girls wear pink? I guess some of you may come from cultures where boys don't wear blue and girls wear pink, but in the West, that's been the case for a long time. Boys wear blue. Boys tend to have things like dinosaurs on their clothes, and girls have, say, princesses or unicorns or something like that. But how do we know that boys wear blue and girls wear pink? This is an advertisement from a progressive clothing store putting dinosaurs on clothes for girls as well. Here's another question. How do we know what manners are? What are good manners? How do you behave, for example, if you are invited to a dinner party? How do we know that? Why is it that in some cultures, for example, in England, if you were to burp, so to oral flatulence at a dinner party, that would be considered rude. But I'm informed that in some other cultures, to burp after a meal at the table is considered to praise the meal and to let them know that you have enjoyed it. So how do we know what is polite, what is right, or what is wrong in different settings? Here's another example about things like national identity. How do we know what it means to belong to a certain nation, for example? Many of you may recognize this picture as being associated with the country of Scotland. You see the background and the kilt and the beret he's wearing. This is assumed to be typically Scottish. But when you actually look at this kind of identity, historically, you see that it was actually a kind of invention of the nationalist romantic Scottish movement in the 18th century. We often use the word Celtic to describe Scottish identity, for example. But again, the word Celtic was first used to describe Scots in the 18th century. And it was kind of appropriated from another use in order to describe the Scottish national identity. So where do we get our national identities from? Where do we get our racial identity, even our racial identities from? It may seem very obvious what our race is and what that means. But I was talking to a professor in the southern United States, and she told me about a student who had come from the Dominican Republic to study at her university. And this student from the Dominican Republic said, I didn't realize that I was Black until I came to America. So what she was saying is that what her racial identity meant had changed hugely from her home country to now being in the United States of America. So even some things that we assume, identity things, where do we get that understanding of what it means to be a certain, I'll go back, a certain race? So all these examples I've given you are just fleshing out the topic. And the topic I'm going to talk about is called social constructionism. Social constructionism. And what it says is that all the things I've just talked about are not givens. They're not somehow written in a law of the universe, but all these things we just thought about are socially constructed. So our idea of what it means to be a Black person or a white person is socially constructed. Our national identities are socially constructed. Manners and what is polite and what is not is socially constructed. And gender roles, gender identity, what colors we wear, what clothes, are all socially constructed. And what they would mean by socially constructed is that they are created in history through human action. And this idea goes further to say that all human knowledge is socially constructed. There is no given for what is true. In one sense, everything that we know is socially constructed. It is constructed by human beings over time. And this is the authors who popularized this idea or wrote about it. It's from 1966. Peter Berger and Thomas Luckman, two sociologists, and they wrote this book. You can sort of see it, The Social Construction of Reality. So everything that we take to be reality is actually constructed socially by societies. And it's interesting that if you look at the subtitle at the bottom of the book, it says a treatise in the sociology of knowledge. And so that's what this is particularly about, is how do we know things? How do we know what we know? And they would say nothing that we know is a given certainty. Everything we know has just been constructed across time. So let me just give you a couple of examples. Oh, this is a quote from the book. So society is part of a human world made by men, inhabited by men, and in turn making men in an ongoing historical process. And actually, it's quite an interesting quote. This is a quote from the book, not just for what it says, but also what it says at another level, because it's interesting that today, nobody would write a book on sociology using the word men. They would say people or men and women. And that just shows how these people that wrote that book in 1966 were a product of their society. Whereas today, when we're much more aware of gender issues, no one would use that phrasing. But let me just give you a couple of examples. I won't give you that one. I'll just talk about something else. This is about Scottish identity, which I'm not sure is relevant for most of you around the world, but is quite relevant for us in the British Isles. But let me give you an example of the creation of knowledge, the social creation of knowledge from medicine. And I want us to think about the diagnosis of ADHD, as we call it, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. I hope you that translates and you're familiar with that. It's a well-documented now hyperactivity disorder in young children, and particularly in boys, ADHD. Now, the question that the social constructionists would ask is, was ADHD discovered or was it invented? Do you get that question? It's, was it discovered or was it invented? In other words, did we discover something that was there all the time, or did medicine, psychology invent something? Did it really just give a name to what was perhaps just normal behavior for active boys? Is it, for example, just that because our education systems have now become, say, based in more in models where children are expected to sit down and be quiet and pay attention to a teacher for long periods of time, that we now see them being hyperactive as abnormal, when actually that was probably in the past just normal behavior for children. Now someone has labeled that abnormal and then come up with a diagnosis, ADHD. And then there can be a treatment for that diagnosis. And so this is the question that the social constructionists are always asking, is knowledge, you could look at something like depression. Is depression something that was invented, a diagnostic category? And perhaps the social constructionists would also look at the question of power, of when someone invents a new area of knowledge, it gives them power over that. So for example, for psychiatrists, inventing things like ADHD or depression, it gave them the power to define normal and abnormal, the power to treat, the power to lock people up when they are mentally ill, and then also maybe then there's financial power for pharmaceuticals, for example, prescribing Ritalin and other things for ADHD. So the social constructionists would really question all the time, how do we know what we know? And they would actually say that everything that we know is a product of society, of people constructing that knowledge. Now, the theory, I don't want to go very long into the theory because of time, but if you want to read more about it, they discuss how this arises, this social construction of knowledge. But what they would say, which is an interesting social theory and behind much of what you would call social contract theory, is that society was originally sort of chaotic. And so people had to come up with rules of how to behave. For example, you don't burp when you are at a dinner party, or if you are in a sexual relationship with someone, then that is an exclusive thing and someone else can't then start a sexual relationship with you. In other words, marriage, something like marriage. The social constructionists would say marriage is just a social construction, but they would say in order to live well together, we need rules about how we live. And so these rules then become kind of externalized. They're things we need for to have an ordered society, but then they become externalized in rules and laws. And then the second step is objectification, which is where these rules or laws, we forget that over time we constructed them, but they become as if they were objectively real and true. So for example, you could think of in the West, largely boys wear blue and girls wear pink. And for people growing up, it becomes a kind of just a given. We forget that it was just at some time a convention that perhaps through some sort of fashion or of the time was was invented, and we treat it as if it is part of objective reality. And then the last stage is called internalization, where those rules about or understanding about objective reality gets internalized in successive generations so that they become a deep part of their being. So for example, in marriage, social constructionists would say it's just a social construction, but as it becomes internalized, future generations assume that it's a real thing, that is an absolute given about reality, and they've internalized that and, for example, feel guilty if they break marriage bonds and are unfaithful, and they feel anger towards other people that break these rules, etc. So that's just the way that they see it developing. So it's very, that's just a very brief overview. Okay, now it's important as we finish just exploring what the theory is to think about, in a way, what is the sort of the usefulness of this idea or part of the outcome of this idea of social constructionism. We don't need to look at that. Okay, and one of the most important outcomes for the social constructionists is that it makes us ask the question, who says so? Who says that boys wear blue? You know, who says that, you know, to be Scottish means you're wild or something like that, you know, unruly? Who says that, you know, this boy is hyperactive? All the time, it gets us to ask, you know, who is defining reality? And why are they defining it? And that's the second question of power. So who is telling us what is right and what is wrong, what is normal, what is abnormal, what is socially acceptable, what is not? And what are the power relationships in these definitions of reality? So, for example, as I said, a theorist like Michel Foucault, you might have heard the French sociologist, philosopher, Michel Foucault, he did a lot of work on the sociology of knowledge around medicine and particularly on mental illness. And he argues that doctors, by extending their area of knowledge from the physical body into the mind, then allowed doctors to begin to have power, in one sense, over the mind, over what was normal, what was abnormal, what was sane, what was insanity. And then it gave pharmaceutical companies, for example, power and financial power and gain to prescribe antidepressants or Ritalin for people with ADHD, etc., etc. And I mean, you know, you can obviously see an extreme of this, say, in the Soviet Union, where at certain times political dissidents were defined by some of the medical profession as being insane, because communism was patently, obviously to the Communist Party, logical and rational and completely correct. Anybody who argued with it must be irrational and therefore insane. So the people that define reality can then have power over other people and kind of bend them to their view of reality. So the social constructionists really encourage people to ask the question, who says so? Okay, we'll go through that slide. And behind this, right at the bottom of it, I think, is the idea of freedom. So if we realize that all knowledge is socially constructed, then we are free to reject that knowledge and to come up with our own knowledge for ourselves. And I think this is the movement that is most deeply behind it, a move towards the freedom of the individual to reject knowledge that is given to them and to assert their own reality over knowledge that is given to them. And this is part of, I guess you could see this very much in the transgender movement, where they would say, well, who has been defining gender? It is cisgender people, heterosexual cisgender people, who have defined gender as just having male and female. And but actually we can define our gender for ourselves, and we can be whatever we want to be as defined from ourselves and not given to us by society. So that would be a good example of the way that social constructionism underlies a lot of these contemporary movements in things like gender and sexuality. Okay, so that's a bit about the theory. Now I'm gonna critique the theory, and then I'm going to give some observations from a Christian point of view. Just keeping my eye on the time. I'm running out of time already. Okay. So I think this is very important, and this is from I think from a biblical point of view, that actually the idea is a partial truth. It's not totally wrong, neither is it a total truth. And I think this is one of its problems, that it portrays itself as a total truth, but it is a partial truth about some aspects of reality. And the reason I say that is because if you look in the Bible, you see God inviting Adam to name the animals, and God brings them to Adam to name. And so there's this mandate, this commission actually, that we can construct our understanding of reality through language. And I also think that yeah, you know, for example, we can construct systems of social cohesion, like democracy, or we can construct legal systems, systems of law. You know, the Bible doesn't tell us everything about the world and social functioning. We'll look at what it does tell us, but there is a freedom that God has given us to construct, construct reality to some extent, and we'll see that not totally, but partially, using language. And so that's, you know, I think it's a partial truth. Yeah, when you look at something like, why do boys wear blue and girls wear pink? You can probably trace it back in history to a certain time period in history where that became a fashion. I've heard, I haven't checked it out fully, but I hear that in Victorian England, for example, boys commonly wore pink, but it changed somewhere between there and now. So when you think about this theory, there is a lot of truth to it. And also, I would say, in a fallen world, it's very good to ask the question, who said so? Who told you that? And in fact, that is the question that God asks Eve after she has eaten the fruit. He says, who told you you were naked? And it can be a very important question to ask, to explore who's defining reality and why, and to whose benefit. So it is a partial truth, but it's not a total truth about reality. And that is one of my critiques about this idea, is that it portrays itself as if it was a total truth about all reality. And some things happen when it does that. One of the things that happens is that if everything in reality is socially constructed, then everything becomes relativistic. Everything we know is just a product of history and society and human action. Then everything becomes relativistic. And then it stops us saying, well, this is better than that. So for example, many parts of the world, including Western Europe and America, would say that female genital mutilation is wrong. But in parts of the world, it's a socially constructed norm. It's a normal thing in some parts of the world. And if everything is socially constructed, then how can the West criticize cultures that have female genital mutilation if the West's ideas of what is right and proper is also just a social construction? Do you see my point? There is no position, if everything is socially constructed, there's no position from outside of that from which you can critique anybody else's ideas. And a second problem that then comes if you see it as a total theory is this, and I found a meme, or not a meme, yeah, a little meme about this. If social constructionism is true, then social constructionism itself must be a social construct. Do you see that? If everything is socially constructed, then the idea of social constructionism must be socially constructed. And yet the authors of the book talk about it as if it is a total reality and totally true, as if it is the truth. And yet they have to admit that they are two, sociologists writing in the 1960s who constructed this idea and made a considerable amount of money, perhaps from selling books and lecturing about the idea. So who constructed social constructionism? You just get lost in this vortex of relativism. So I'm going to just take 5 minutes more. Thank you for staying with me and listening. I just want to think now about a Christian critique. And if I could recommend one book to read, Very short book, 62 pages. C.S. Lewis is The Abolition of Man. Very, very dense, but is excellent in this area. And C.S. Lewis in this argues for a worldview in which certain attitudes are really true and others false to the kind of thing the universe is and the kind of thing we are. And what he's really arguing in the book, actually, he doesn't argue it from a Christian viewpoint, but this is the Christian viewpoint as well. This is what I'm saying, is that in the Christian viewpoint, I'll see if I've got a slide, no, a little bit later. I want to introduce you to the idea from a Christian viewpoint that there is form, or you could say structure and freedom, form and freedom. So because there is a creator of reality, there is actually a given shape to reality. God has made the whole world that we see and given it a certain shape. And he has created human beings and given us a certain shape. And in the Bible, of course, it tells us that we are made in the image of God. So we are not just any way, any which way we want. We are made in the image of God. And so if we understand who God is, we understand who we are. So there is a form, there is a shape to reality. It is not just a free for all to decide exactly what reality is, but there is also freedom in the Christian worldview. God creates the macro, the big reality, but as we already looked at, he invites Adam and Eve to create the micro reality. He asked them to name the animals. And in Genesis 1:28, he says to them to order and subdue the world, to order, to fill and order the world. So that's called the creation commission. So there is a form, but God also invites Adam and Eve to be co-creators. But in being co-creators, we do not have total freedom just to make anything any way we like. We have freedom to make things within this form. And so I'll just give you a little example from the Bible, just to think about this. And let's just think about the topic of prayer, for example. Now, in the Bible, it doesn't say very much about how you pray. You can pray standing up or sitting down. You can pray long prayers or short prayers. You can pray in many different languages. You can pray facing any direction. It's interesting, it's quite different, I think, from an Islamic view of prayer. In the Christian view of prayer, there is tremendous freedom around prayer. But there is a form to what prayer is, a created reality of prayer. For example, in Matthew 6, when Jesus is talking about prayer, he says, when you pray, don't babble on like the pagans. So don't, just use lots and lots of words or long words. And why? Because he says, because God, your Father, hears you and sees you. So you don't need to try to persuade him to hear you by using long words or special words. Because he is your loving Father, he sees and he hears. So there is a form to prayer, which is that it can just be very simple conversation with God. And there's another form he talks about. He says, when you pray, don't do it on the street corners so that people praise you, what a holy person you are. He says, do it in secret in your room. And so what he's saying is there, the form of prayer is it's not about praise. It's not about people just saying how wonderful you are. It's about talking to God. And that's a form. But within that, there's tremendous freedom. So what is our job as Christians? And this I'm going to finish as our job as Christians. Well, I think we have to take seriously this idea of form and freedom, that we are actually given the freedom to construct some aspects of reality. What does a healthcare system look like? What does your department that you work in look like? How do people relate to one another? What are the structures we have? These are all areas which God gives us to be co-creators, but there is a form as well which we are co-creators under. And I think our job as Christians and Christians in healthcare is to really construct the parts of reality which we have power over, in one sense, which we can construct, but to construct them in ways which are in line with the macro reality of who God is. And I'll just give you a little example of this. This is just an example. Again, I'm going to use the kind of communist Eastern Europe as an example, just because it was really this massive social experiment of trying to do away with the macro reality that God has given and saying we can recreate what it means to be human. And one of the things that was done at that time was saying, look, people are like machines. They're not created in the image of God. We're biological machines, and therefore we can work out exactly scientifically how much room each person needs. And we can put people as little units on top of each other and make these big tower blocks. But of course, what happened is they became places of loneliness, ugliness. People didn't care for the environment. When you treat people like machines, in some ways they become like machines. They become less than human, less human. And this social experiment, they became terrible places to live. And I would argue that is because the people that thought up this idea didn't understand what it meant to be human. That to be human is to be in the image of God and is to be relational. And architects today are always thinking about the relational environment and how we can actually build our constructed buildings and institutions to encourage relationships. And that's something that comes from the Bible. So I won't go through all these. Here we go. This is, okay, form and freedom. And these are some of the creational patterns, I think, that we need to think about, some of the givens that we need to put in practice as we create or sub-create, co-create reality under God. So these are some of the things. Obviously, at the bottom, you can see relationship, your wards, the places you work. If you have any power over what those look like, you can encourage relationships. There should be places where there is goodness and beauty. Can you bring beauty into your workplace? They should be places of where service, love is encouraged, trust. Places where growth and flourishing, where people can take responsibility. And so, you know, because these are the character of God. And so the things that we shape in our society should be shaped with these values in mind. I think that's my last, that's my last slide. So there's much more I could say, but that is a condensed version of the lecture. If you do want to hear more, I think it's on, we have a podcast, which is on a podcast site called Podbean, and you can go Google Labrie Podbean, and you should find the full lecture there. But I'll hand over to Peter. Probably got some good questions, I hope.
Thank you very much, Jim. Perhaps just to start you off, Jim, it's said, of course, that Christianity itself is a social construct, and that it's a system that's been invented, if you like, to give some people authority and power over others and restrict freedom of others. And that Christian concepts like sexuality within marriage, like the sanctity of life, like the whole stewardship principle, which enables science, like human government, that these things are all just social constructs invented by Christians to give some people power over another. And that could be quite a difficult question to answer. So I wonder, just your reflections on how do we respond to people who say that Christianity is a social construct, just designed to give some people power over other people and take away their freedom?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think the first thing we should do is admit that some things within Christianity are social constructs, and some of those are valid social constructs, and some maybe not valid. You know, Christianity is always situated, and we're all situated within culture, and so there is some absolutely valid social constructionism. For example, you could think about the architecture of a church. You know, why do churches in England have steeples, you know, and spires? You know, that is a sort of social construct. They don't have to have that. How we do church government, for example, you know, do we have an eldership or a pastor or etc.? You know, all of that, I think, is valid social constructionism. But there is also, I think, a given. So that, for example, this is what I would argue, in your, let's say, government of your church, it should, for example, treat people as human beings made in the image of God, and it should encourage responsibility amongst the congregation. It should encourage, and, you know, a great book that I've been reading is called To Change the World by Hunter Davidson, I think. And he argues that power itself is not a bad thing, because actually power in one way is a gift from God, because power is the ability to change the world. And of course, the question then is, you know, how do you use your power and to what end? And that is obviously where the church has gone wrong many times. It has used its power to control or to dominate. And I think we have to admit that and repent, you know, and seek forgiveness. But, you know, and to make sure that we use our power to serve, to look after those who are most needy in our societies, as the Bible says. So yeah, I think that, you know, that said, one of the things that is very important for us to do as Christians is not confuse what is a kind of a creational pattern that God has given with a social construction. We often do that, you know, we often make something that is relative into something absolute. But of course, you know, the trend today is to make something that's absolute into something that's relative. And a good example would be, you know, the press on gender, for example. You know, I think in the Bible we clearly see the male-female structure of gender. And I've also done a lecture on why are there two genders, male and female? Why did God just not make one? You know, and why did he make sexual reproduction? Why didn't he just make it so that, you know, our arm could fall off and turn into a new human being? You know, he could have done that. But I think these things, these structures that God have given, all have a deeper meaning as well. And when we do away with those, we actually begin to lose something of what it means to be human.
Yes, and so we're being often told today, marriage is a social construct, sex is a social construct, gender is a social construct, reproduction is a social construct. The next question here, how should Christians challenge LGBT queer theory, which gives rise to the very concept of men and women being social or artificial constructs?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I've tried to do that in this lecture where I tried to think about male and female. What I tried to do is not think about gender roles. That is a valid thing to talk about. But I asked the question, you know, why do we have men and women, male and female? Why do we have male and female? Why is that important? And what I thought about is that if you look at many worldviews, they have an idea that the original human being was a male and female together in one being. In fact, God is male and female together in one being. And what actually happened at the kind of fall, as it were, is they got separated into two separate sexes. And that salvation is by joining back together. And I thought of this, when I was thinking about this, I thought this is actually a myth of radical independence. Basically, what it's saying is you have everything you need in yourself. because you are, you know, there's both the original human being is male and female, and God has everything he needs within himself. But the Christian worldview is very different, because God is unity, he's one God, but also diversity. He is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And the three persons of the Trinity are interdependent on one another. They share love and trust and interdependence. And when God created us in his image, he made us for interdependence. In other words, that we need other people, because that's being made in his image. And so, you know, we need male and female. And you look at it, you just think about reproducing. In order to have children, you need a man and a woman. And to bring up children, I think you need a man and a woman, a husband and a wife. And so the whole way that we're made biologically as two sexes, I say that the meaning of that is sacramental. In other words, it points to a deeper reality, which is this deeper reality of that we are interdependent beings. We are made for relationships of trust. We are not self-sufficient on our own, and we are fruitful together, not just on our own. Of course, you know, modern medical science is changing all that, isn't it? You can, you know, have a child just on yourself, you know, yourself as it were, and it's really kind of changing all that. So, I mean, in answer to that question, I would say, you know, one has to kind of, I think, understand the deeper meanings behind the structures, the form that God has given, and really argue for the beauty of those. A colleague of mine recently, he runs a discussion group at the L'Abri in Canadian L'Abri, and this lady who said she was a white witch, you know, a kind of magic user, kind of a white witch, started coming to this meeting. And when he described the Christian view of sexuality to her, she said, wow, that is so beautiful. I just wish that could be true. And she saw the beauty of it. So I think we have to, you know, argue winsomely for the beauty, but we need to then understand the depth of the Christian worldview.
I guess so much in the Christian worldview is about diversity and complementarity together, isn't it? You've got light and dark, sea and land, earth and sky, men and women, animals and human beings, and so on. It's the two being together. Question here from, sorry, let you respond to that.
Go ahead. Yeah. No, that's fine. You go ahead.
So next question, sociology as a meta-narrative. Any comments about the relationship between sociology and science? Is sociology a science in the strictest sense? Is sociology confusing objective facts with subjective research?
Yeah. John Smuts. Yeah. Hello, John. Yeah, well, I don't know if you're South African, but it's a very interesting topic to think about, and just think about in a Dutch Reformed direction, there is a thinker called Abraham Kuyper, and he was actually the Prime Minister of Holland at a certain time, and then his thoughts were taken on by a philosopher called Herman Dooyeweerd. A very strange name. We can maybe put that on the chat later. Herman Dooyeweerd, and he had this idea of, he called it sphere sovereignty. Sphere like a circle, or a 3D circle. And he says there are different spheres in society, in reality, different spheres. So there might, for example, be one sphere might be society, another sphere would be let's say science, for example, another one would be the church, for example. And he would say each of these are important parts of reality and being human, but the problem comes when one of these spheres, these circles, becomes all of reality. And I think what's happening today is where sociology is becoming all of reality. I mean, science, in the Enlightenment and later, someone like Richard Dawkins would be science as being all of reality. And today we're in this, where kind of sociology will give us this perfect explanation of everything. And then it will allow us as well the kind of salvation through sociology. We can save everything through social programs and social means. So I don't think the problem is sociology itself. It's very important, you know, it's an important area of study. That would be Doyever's point. It's an important sphere, but the problem comes when we make it primary or dominant, or the only sphere that we see everything through. And Doyever, interestingly, would also argue the same for the church, actually. He would say that the institution of the church is a sphere and should have control and some sovereignty over its own sphere. But if the church becomes in control of everything, then that is a problem. So, yeah, I hope that answers your question, yeah.
Thank you. So Jaideep Rayapudi is asking, would I be correct in assuming that the relatively different responses to COVID are mild examples of the social construct of reality? So he says, I'm keen not to get infected. My colleagues don't seem to give a second thought to it. But I think we also see that at one extreme, we've got people saying the government must exercise all power to protect us from this terrible disease. And then at the other end, we've got people saying, oh, this is just a big power grab by governments to take away people's freedom.
Yeah. I mean, I guess, you know, the idea of social constructionism would, I mean, this is part of its use. That's why I said, you know, it is a partial truth. You can look at, you know, what different governments are saying, and it's good to ask, you know, who said that? You know, who is saying, for example, you know, some governments are saying, well, economics are more important than individuals, so let's keep all the shops open. Let's, you know, this is what Trump has been saying in America, really putting economics over individuals. In the UK, we, you know, have been putting kind of individuals over economics and shutting things down and having a lockdown. And, you know, people put a lot of basis, for example, in science, you know, saying, what is the scientific, you know, what's the science telling us? And of course, the science can say, you know, predictive models, but in the end, we have to choose, don't we, according to what we are going to prioritize. So, yeah, I think it is an example, and it's, you know, maybe the usefulness of it, who's saying what and why and what's the basis, and using that as an analysis for thinking about how we manage this pandemic.
Thank you, Jim. We're almost out of time, and I'm afraid we've got time just for one more question. But from Lydia Akinola here, how can Christians become more culturally conversant in the way that you've been introducing us to today? It seems that there are always new ideas and theories, postmodernism, social constructionism, critical race theory is the latest thing that arise, and they can be difficult to understand without a proper understanding of sociology and philosophy, and sharing the gospel into this context can be a huge challenge. So how can we become more culturally conversant? I guess this is really at the heart of what L'Abri is all about.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose, Lydia, one important thing is I think, you know, understanding the Christian worldview very, very deeply and not superficially. You know, I meet many Christians who, you know, their understanding of Christianity is sound bites and kind of slogans, and actually getting deeper and deeper into the Christian worldview. I mean, I'd recommend a book that is a good kind of introduction. Just it's quite a short book, but I found it tremendously helpful. Is a book called Creation Regained by Al Walters. Creation Regained by Al Walters. It's very helpful, just to giving you a kind of really good biblical sort of worldview, and I think that, yeah, that is a key thing, because then you can begin to see ideas, you know, critical race theory, and see what is good about it and what is, you know, wrong about it in terms of the Christian worldview. And I mean, there are lots of good resources. Obviously, Peter, you know, I would recommend, we have our podcast site, English L'Abri, at Podbean, and there's also L'Abri Ideas Library, which is our lecture library, which has lots of kind of culturally relevant, engaged lectures. And yeah, I mean, yeah, just if you keep in touch with those and look at what's going on, there are Christians who are writing good books on these things and thinking about them deeply. But I think the more we know the Christian worldview, the more we understand it, the deeper we understand it, I think the more you can immediately see, you know, yes, that's true. You know, no, that's not true. And usually these, you know, these new ideas and philosophies, so they usually have something in them that's true, you know, and then something that's not true. And you know, being able to, that is the greatest skill, being able to just discern that. But you do that, I think, through knowing the Christian worldview very well.
I guess they talk about the best way of identifying a counterfeit banknote is not to learn all the counterfeits, but to know the real thing absolutely perfectly, so that you can spot the differences and see what about it is right and what about it is wrong. We'll be listening to Dr. James Paul on Is Reality Socially Constructed? Jim Paul from L'Abri. Thank you very much, Jim, for this illuminating talk. So thank you again, Jim. Thank you to our translators. Thank you, Josh, for the technical stuff behind the scenes, and to all of you for joining us today. God bless you.
Good. Thank you.